You know the story by heart. A man nailed to a tree at a place called Golgotha, a sky that went black at noon, a veil in the temple rent from top to bottom. But have you ever stopped to imagine what moved in the unseen when those things happened? The urgent motions in a realm the eye cannot see. What if the suffering you watched from the hill was also the center of a lawful cosmic exchange, and two of heaven's chief agents were sent on a secret mission that changed the posture of the powers themselves? If you want to stay with me through this, take a moment to like and subscribe, and stay until the end. There is something in this scene that will not only deepen your awe, but steady your courage when suffering comes. Now come close, listen and imagine. At Golgotha, the air tasted of dust and iron. A crowd pressed like a tide around the hill, some mocking, some weeping, some numb with fear. The Roman centurion moved among his men with the blunt efficiency of occupation. Ropes creaked, sponges were raised on long reeds, sandals scuffed the packed earth. Above it all, the sky, once a hard, bright noon, fell into an unnatural thickness. The sun seemed to be smothered, as if heaven itself had taken a breath and held it. From that hush came a voice that broke the distance, the cry recorded by the evangelists, a word that carried the weight of a people's sorrow and the shape of a promise. The man on the center stake lived the fullness of human submission. He did not call down a host to save him from the cross. He yielded his will, and in that yielding there was authority. Now imagine, not by way of new scripture, but in the manner of an eye opened to reverent seeing, the roof of that visible scene lifting like a curtain. Above the hill, in the stillness that no human ear could hear, there was movement. Not the frantic motion of a rumor, but the measured, certain stride of one who bears an office. Michael came first, though not as a warrior lusting for noise. He carried the presence of command about him, a posture like a blade held at rest, an authority whose very quietness suggested that something lawful was about to be done. With him was Uriel, called by ancient voices Light, a name the people of old would speak when they wished to point to illumination itself. I say the name with care. Uriel belongs to the memory ways of our ancestors, and to the literature that kneels at the edges of Scripture. A traditional figure who helps us picture what mercy might look like in light form. He was not there to invent doctrine. He came as a witness, as one who reveals. They were not sent to free the man on the cross from the cross. That had not been the plan. What was at stake was deeper and more exacting, a judicial transfer, a reclaiming of what lay in the custody of death and deceit. Below the hill, in the place that Scripture sometimes names Sheol or Hades, the prisons of the realm of the dead stood like doors of iron. There were keys in the dark, not mere implements, but symbols of authority, seals upon the hold of sin, claims that certain powers had laid and held over creation. In the human drama on the hill, something had been enacted that the world could read on its face as cruelty. In the heavens, it read as the fulfillment of ancient words. The groaning of the servant in Psalm, the wound of the suffering one in Isaiah, the strange victory that looks like defeat. Michael knew the statutes. He came not to overthrow the plan, but to enforce the covenant. He did not rush. Before any motion, there was an inventory. What claims had been lodged? What scrolls had been rolled and sealed? What name had been invoked against the people of God? Uriel stood with a light that was not spectacle, but clarity. He showed what every seal said, the law's phrases caught in ink and shadow. These were images, interpretive, a way, in the spirit, to see how heaven reads the drama of the cross. When Michael reached out, it was as a magistrate, taking from one hand what belonged to another. On the hill below, a few human voices rose, a mocker's laugh, a woman's muffled sob, the rasp of a soldier's question. The temple veil, that fabric that hung between the holy place and the holiest, waited like a threshold. At the moment when the breath of the man left his body, the fabric tore, from top to bottom, and the sound of that rent was like the sound of a covenant broken in its old strictness and made open. The tearing was both a toppling of separation and a legal opening. It was a sign for the living and a rupture in the order that had kept God's presence veiled. The priests who stood in the courts were stunned. The centurion who had watched with hardened eyes said, as the Gospel tells, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." In that human astonishment, there was a recognition the heavens had long been arranging. Beneath, in Sheol, the captains of shadow did not speak in long, persuasive words. They expected a victory already won. Lucifer, that bright one, who in his prime was called Morning Star, but who had set himself against the Most High, had over the ages built for himself a posture of claim. He and his hosts saw in crucifixion the confirmation of their charge, that death binds, and that God's purposes are stymied by suffering. They were wrong. They meant to collect. Heaven meant to settle accounts. Michael moved first. I cannot give you
a formula of a heavenly courtroom. The language below is a sober attempt to imagine, reverently, the kinds of images the scriptures themselves use, keys and scrolls. Michael's hand, when it rested on the first seal, did not crush it like a plow. It opened it, as a king opens an edict to carry its authority. Where Lucifer and his captors had thought to bind, Michael unfurled the covenants that reasserted God's claim. A legal reversal, if you will, but a legal reversal grounded in sacrifice, not conquest. Uriel's light ran along the script, the promises fulfilled, the names written in grace, the debts settled by a ransom accepted rather than stolen. They moved with precision, not a war of chaos, but a courtly enforcement. There was no triumphant noise. Think instead of a bell that rings within the chest, a signal that something in the moral order has shifted. As each seal gave, chains loosened in the place where the dead lay. The captors felt the change as a pulling at their grasp, an unmaking of their presumption. Lucifer's face, imagine only the shadow of it. We do not glorify him by fascination, tightened into a hardness that comes when a plan collapses. He had expected thunder. Instead, there was the quiet of a verdict read. At a point, the scene widened. In the spirit, the evangelist's old line about Christ preaching to the spirits in prison came like a key for interpretation. This is not an exposition that claims to add to Scripture. Rather, it offers a way to see how the Gospel's reach extends. The man on the hill had broken the wall by bearing what was due. The entrance to the place of death felt the tremor and folded. Michael, by covenant authority, laid hands on the keys. If keys are images, their meaning is simple: power to bind and power to loose. The power given to Christ, to bind and loose, to open and close, is the language of authority repeated through Scripture. Michael's action thus became a public enforcement of that authority, done in obedience to the one who had submitted to the cross. Uriel stood at the margin of that enforcement, not as one who arbitrates, but as one who reveals. He shone, and the light did two things. It showed the mystery, and it exposed the lie. Where chains had seemed absolute, their seams showed. Where contracts appeared sealed by darkness, the wording was legible. Uriel's illumination did not create law. It simply read, with compassion, what had been written in mercy. In that reading, the captors turned pale, for their signatures were traced in the things of subjugation, and their names were not in the book of life. There was, in this imagery, a confrontation that was less a duel of spears than a settling of accounts. Michael, with the steady hand of authority, secured what the darkness had arrogated. Uriel, with the steady light, declared the reason. Do not imagine that heaven delighted in vengeance. Imagine instead the sorrow of one righting a theft. For God is not vindictive for the pleasure of it. God restores order, repairs the breach, and takes back what is due by covenant. The angels operated within those categories, enforcement and revelation, sword and lamp, but both instruments of righting. Back on the hill, earth quivered. The crowd heard the veil tear, and they looked up. A centurion's voice, rough with weather and iron, spoke the truth because truth was visible. This was no ordinary man. A divine stamp lay upon the scene. The sky, which had been thick with a midday darkness, began in its own slow way to clear, like a curtain drawn to show a page already written. Men buried the dead as they always did. Joseph of Arimathea came with his care, and the body was laid in a tomb. The order of events did not break the flow of history: arrest, trial, crucifixion, burial, and then, as the evangelists would testify, the unexpected emptying of the tomb after 3 days. But between burial and the emptying, there was this interior happening: the lawful reclaiming of keys and the loosening of the bonds that death had asserted. Lucifer, in that gathering of shadows, uttered no long speech. He felt the rip where his confidence had been stitched. It is important here to avoid making him the center of drama. Scripture keeps the focus on the one who suffered and was raised. Yet the image helps us see something vital. The powers imagined their victory as inevitable, until a sovereignty more absolute than their cunning moved with the patience and precision of love. The terrified reaction of the demonic host, if we may call it that, is not to be celebrated like a sport, but noted as proof of a deeper reality. God's plan runs through apparent defeat to a greater good. There were small human signs too. A mother's hand reached across the sand for the hem of a cloak. A woman named Mary kept watch with grief that was a slow, hot stone in her throat. The soldiers gambled for the garments, common things of cruelty, and the day folded toward burial. Yet all these intimate details only accentuated a larger truth. Ordinary sorrow and cosmic justice can meet in the same moment, and in that meeting a new access is given. The veil torn meant that the Holy of Holies was no longer a sealed room, but a spring opened. The legal act above was the hinge that made the opening intelligible. As the angels did their work, it remained true that Jesus had not called them down. He had chosen obedience. His triumph lay in surrender. That is the paradox the heavens obey. Victory can wear the clothes of defeat because the defeat is the instrument of redemption. Michael enforced what the obedience
Of the one on the cross had legally authorized. Uriel illuminated the scriptural pattern that made this enforcement necessary. Both served the one who bowed his head and gave up the spirit. If you listen to this from a place of hurt or doubt, let this be the tenderest note. What looked like abandonment was not. The darkness at noon was not the final word. It was the hushed moment in which the covenant's deepest exchange was enacted. The tearing of the veil said to every trembling heart that the way to the divine presence was opened by suffering born in faith. Angels were at work, yes, but their work did not override the choice made on the tree. It fulfilled the consequences that choice carried into the unseen. There are images I will not press beyond their proper bounds. The scrolls and seals, the keys and gates are ways to help our minds grasp what Scripture hints at: that God's victory over death is both personal and juridical. Michael and Uriel as figures help us picture enforcement and revelation. Their motions teach us that heaven is neither distant nor indifferent. It acts with measured justice and with the tenderness of one who understands the cost of reclaiming what was always God's. In the end, the cross was not a failure, but the decisive act by which God unmade the hold of death. Now imagine the captors retreating into a silence that is not merely absence of sound, but the recognition of ruin. Lucifer finds himself in a posture he had not known since his first rebellion: uncertain. The marks upon him are not wounds that make us gloat, but signs that even the greatest of rebels will one day answer to a higher covenant. For those who watch and serve and cry out in secret, Michael's action is a comfort. Heaven attends to justice. For those who suffer, Uriel's light is an assurance. What is hidden is being read, and mercy is working with the law. I stop here in the unfolding only to let this scene sit in your chest for a moment. There is more yet to tell about what followed in the Garden of Burial and in the day that changed the world. There are witnesses and empty linens and a sunrise that did not yet announce its fullness to the soldiers at the tomb. But before we go on, let the truth settle. The cross was not an end of power, but the precise moment power was reconfigured under the rule of sacrificial love. The secret mission of Michael and Uriel did not rob the cross of its sorrow.
It honored that sorrow by giving it its full, lawful consequence. If this glimpse has moved you, hold it gently. In the next stretch, we will walk deeper into what the angels actually did in the courts of the dead, how the keys were carried, and how that movement altered the posture of principalities. We will also reflect on how this secret mission steadies us when our own noonday grows dark. For now, carry the image of a quiet, lawful rescue. Michael's enforcement, Uriel's light, the veil torn, and a world beginning to rearrange itself around a grave that will not hold. When the courts of the unseen opened, they did so with the gravity of legal rights and the tenderness of a rescue. Picture, if you can, a hall where petitions and indictments have weight, where names and debts are kept in ledgers older than memory. Michael did not burst in with trumpets alone, he presented credentials. Uriel did not merely shine, he laid out the text that made the action lawful. In that dark tribunal, the seals that bound death were examined, the claims of the accuser confronted, and the one who had paid the ransom stood, not as a litigant grasping power, but as the surety whose obedience perfected the case. Keys were borne in hands that had known the measure of justice. Some keys were forged of covenant, others seemed like phrases of scripture shaped into metal. Names, promises, the weight of vows fulfilled. These were not ornaments. Each key fit a lock in the dominion of the dead. Each unlock unlatched a jurisdiction that had kept humanity captive. Principalities that had leaned on the certainty of demise found themselves answering to countersigned decrees. Justice met mercy. Claims were set against payment. Sentences were re-examined in the light of the cross. The posture of the powers changed not by mere force, but by the sudden reordering of legal reality. Think of a fortress whose gates, by law, must open once the rightful bearer produces the writ. The monsters of accusation may roar, but they cannot stand where the court has spoken. Thus the angels' labor was both judicial and executive. They read what had been written by obedience, and then executed what that reading required. This is the mystery often passed over. Heaven's might moves most decisively when it accords with what has already been accomplished in suffering, when law and love keep the same counsel. Down below, the garden of burial kept its small human watchfulness. The women who came at dawn carried memory and habit. They expected to tend a corpse, not to find a sentence overturned. The watch, those soldiers whose duty was to secure, felt the strain of cosmic things pressing on the ordinary, an earthquake that shook the rock, and angelic appearance that rolled the stone as if to reveal what the law had now unsealed. Empty linens remained, not as proof of theft, but as the sign language of a new order. The grave's tenancy had been lawfully terminated. Mary stood and saw what propriety could not explain. Linen folded, presents absent, a garden rearranged. Her grief and bewilderment were honest movers of the scene. Heaven did not erase the ache. Instead, it wrote the verdict into the fabric of human sorrow. That sorrow could be honored and yet redeemed. The soldiers, who had been stationed for fear of theft, found their fear turned inward to astonishment. Their sleeping was not merely sleep, but the hush of a world recalibrating. For those who read this in their own noon of darkness, hold fast to the picture. A lawful rescue takes time and involves details you cannot always see. The angel's mission steadies us because it shows how heaven answers both heart and ledger. When abandonment feels absolute, recall that the torn veil announced access achieved by suffering. When accusations circle like vultures, remember that a legal reckoning has been enacted, not by arbitrary wrath, but by the one who loved and obeyed. The work in the courts of the dead assures us that mercy does not trespass upon justice, rather it fulfills it. The day was not yet bright when these things moved. Dawn had not made its proclamation, and yet the first notes of the new creation were audible to those who had eyes to listen. The stone that sealed the tomb had been rolled, but the story had not been verbally finished for the living who would run, weep, and wonder. There remained a short, stunned interval between law and proclamation, a hinge before the gospel would be sung aloud through meeting after meeting, voice after voice.
In that pause, the linens lay, the guards lay prostrate with dread, and the garden held its breath, as if the earth itself waited to see whether the verdict would take flesh and walk into the light. And then, in the quietest register of morning, one figure moved toward that stillness, closer than flinch or faith, nearer than fear or hope. What she would meet there would alter the cadence of grief everywhere. She stepped into the dim of the garden as one steps into a vow, hesitant, certain, carrying the small rites of love. The pathways were still cool with the last breath of night. The stones held the weight of what had been buried there. When she drew near the place, her eyes, sharpened by anguish, saw figures in the hollow of the tomb where sorrow had been laid. 2 were seated where the body had rested, angels, their raiment like the tone of the sky at first light, their faces fixed upon the empty place as if to bear witness. One was at the head, the other at the feet. Each sat where linen had once been folded. They asked her, plainly, the question that had already lived in her heart. "Woman, why do you weep?" Her answer came like a fountain of memory and pain. "They have taken away my Lord," she said, "and I know not where they have laid him." Voice to voice, she spoke the truth she could not yet bear to change into hope. The angels listened as one who keeps record. They did not chide, they did not console with easy speech. Instead, one turned and spoke to her of that absence with the calm of watchers who have seen the turning of a great warrant. He did not pronounce the proclamation that would fill the town, but his words were a hinge. "Woman, why do you weep? Whom do you seek?" She named her sorrow in full, and then, leaning into the hollow that had swallowed the friend she loved, she looked not upon the faces of heaven, but upon a man standing there, nearer than any other body, yet different from the crowd she had known. He was in the garden, among the plants she had tended with her hands and memory. His eyes were upon her with a compassion that felt like the raising of a dawn. For a while she did not know him. Grief has a way of reshaping sight, so that what is nearest may be made strange. "Woman," he asked. There was familiarity in the word, and the cadence of one who had given law to her soul. "Woman, why do you weep? Whom do you seek?" She thought him the gardener. Perhaps it was because he stood where the earth still knew the work of hands. Perhaps because in the early hour her mind sought the most common explanation for the presence of another. To her, he was a keeper of plots, a man who would move stones and tend roots. "Sir," she said, "if thou hast borne him hence, tell me where thou hast laid him, and I will take him away." He spoke then her name. It came not as an announcement, but as the opening of a lock. "Mary." The syllable struck the room she had built of loss. In that single, exact calling, remembrance returned, like a sun that had been behind weather and now broke clean. She turned and cried in Aramaic the word that is both plea and worship, "Rabboni," my teacher, my master. The sound of it was an answering of every small fidelity she had kept, the ointment, the tears, the nights of following. In that moment, recognition and recognition's joy flooded her. The person she had thought taken was present, simple and sovereign. She reached as one reaches to hold a thing about to be put away. She would not let sorrow steal him again with the silence of a tomb. Yet he was not to be grasped as if the life between them could be returned to the former shape. Gently, with the firmness of one who both loves and governs, he said, "Touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brethren, and say unto them, I ascend unto my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." His words did more than command. They reframed the very horizon. The intimacy they had shared was not denied, but transfigured. Not a resumption of the old household, but the inauguration of a new ordering. He would be with them, but yet in a manner that would lead beyond familiar confines to the courts of heaven themselves. Mary heard instruction and mission braided together. She was to be not only the first recipient of the sight, but its herald. "Go," he said, "tell them." She went,
and she went as one who has been given a thing too large to keep. Her feet, which had once paced the garden paths in vigil, now became the messengers of an impossible tidings. She ran to those who had been gathered in their fear, the company that had hidden its faces and locked its hope behind shuttered doors. Their sorrow met her return like the echo of their own names. Their faces were worn, their speech uneven with the memory of flight and the pressure of the days that had followed. "Alive!" she cried. "I have seen the Lord!" The words spilled from her in quick, earnest fragments, because the news itself would not be fewer than a shout. "He said unto me these things, and bade me to tell you." They listened with the slow, stubborn doubt of those who had learned to brace for failure. Some recoiled into the only language they knew, silence. Others questioned aloud the sense of what she brought. In the council of their hearts, teachers, fishermen, watchers of a vanished promise, the witness of a woman found its way to be judged. They were surprised, perplexed. They did not yet leap to joy. For many, vision is not proof until sight is shared. The solitary encounter sounds to others like dream until it is made flesh among witnesses. Yet some among them, moved by affection or memory, would soon be drawn outward again. A few, compelled by the exactitude of her telling, by the steadiness in her voice, rose to go with her, each to meet the place where law and love had agreed. When they reached the tomb, they saw the linens. They saw the linen napkin folded where the head had lain. Some believed then, some were amazed and puzzled. All felt the world altered beneath their feet. But there were those who could not at once accept such a reversal. Doubt is a steadfast companion to faith until the meeting of risen reality. Mary, charged with the mission and burning with a faithful gladness that would never be the same, lingered at the threshold of the assembly of grief. She had been given a new office, that of apostle to the apostles, bearing the first message of the new covenant into the company that had been emptied by fear. Her words would be the beginning of speech after the silence of death, and that beginning would ripple outward, to the upper room, to locked doors, to the shivering hopes of men and women who had loved him. The proclamation she carried was not only the overthrow of a verdict, it was the summons to live as if the tomb's claim had been annulled. Meanwhile, in the city that still wore the colors of mourning, the authorities who had watched the stone roll and had slept under such a fear as to seem cast down stirred in their own confusion. Some would tell the tale of the earthquake, some would pass by silence. Others, who had been agents of a fearful duty, would later scatter words to cover what their hearts had felt and what their limbs had fled. But in the hush that followed, the world had received a legal overturning and a personal visitation. Each of these things would find its witness in different tongues and different kinds of courage. Mary, having fulfilled the charge, did not wait for the full swelling of the city's astonishment. She kept near, present to the faces of those who would either harden or open because of what she had seen. The life that walked out of a grave had already begun to make its case, not through spectacle alone, but through the ordering of truth and the naming of names. Where accusation had once made its bed, mercy now took up the instruments of law and, without repudiating justice, perfected it by payment. There would be more conversations, more appearances, and the slow, patient unspooling of what it meant that the sentence was ended. For now, in that garden, the first testimony had been spoken, and it would not be the last. The folded linens, the empty stone, the ordered words of the risen one, all these stood as the first paragraphs of a new proclamation that would be read aloud in rooms and markets, on hills and by the sea. Mary stood among the living and spoke, and by so doing the cadence of grief began to change, not erased, but transfigured into a pilgrimage that would know sorrow and hope braided together, moving toward the hour when the gates of heaven would be opened and the courts of the dead would be emptied by decree and by love. The city still slept through the astonishment, but eyes were waking. Voices would soon follow, and the tidings would march out upon the roads like a new dawn. Mary stood among the living and spoke, and by so doing, the cadence of grief began to change, not erased, but transfigured into a pilgrimage that would know sorrow and hope braided together, moving toward the hour when the gates of heaven would be opened and the courts of the dead would be emptied by decree and by love. The city still slept through the astonishment, but eyes were waking. Voices would soon follow, and the tidings would march out upon the roads like a new dawn.